Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining me for Esther, episode number 2. Today, we're in the second chapter. Remember, what happened last time was that the king had gotten rid of his queen, and not only was she not to be queen anymore, but he has made it to where she's never to come before him again. And at this point in our story, we pick up in chapter 2, verse 1. We see immediately that the king is filled with regret for the decision that he had made. So let's begin. Let's look in chapter 2, verse 1 and see what it says here. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who's in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. First of all, we see that the king is filled with regret for a decision that he had made. And in their culture, in that day and time, any sort of decree to the Medes and Persians that he would put out, it was an absolute decree. It could not be taken back. He couldn't withdraw his decree. He'd have to issue another decree to cover it up or whatever the case may be, as we'll see later, but he couldn't actually take it back. And so he had listened to his advisors so that he would make an example out of the queen and keep everyone in the kingdom happy. And it had an effect literally on every household where there was a man and a wife. And so every decision that he made had a huge impact, and he made a decision that eventually he came to regret. Now it says in chapter 2, verse 1, after these things. And so the story seems to be moving pretty quickly. But there's been quite an amount of time that has passed. Remember, the king had thrown this grand banquet, and basically what he was doing was rallying and trying to get support before going to war. If you dust off your history book, you'll see that Xerxes was defeated in battle, and so probably he comes back and he's looking to be consoled by his queen, maybe pumped up and built up, and she's nowhere to be found, and it's all his fault because he ran her out and took away her position because he listened to the wrong advisors. Well, he has some advisors that give him information now, and they say, hey, here's a good idea. Just pick a new queen. Have all these ladies come in front of you, do all of this. Are they doing that because they want to faithfully serve the king? Probably not. They're probably doing that to make him happy, but also to appease him and keep him from realizing, wait a minute, I made a bad decision because I took your advice, and then having them get into serious trouble. So they're probably actually just trying to protect themselves. One thing we can hold on to is that we have to be careful who we take advice from. We have to really, truly wonder, are they looking out for what's best for us? And this king definitely takes advice from people oftentimes that he should not take advice from, and it costs him dearly and greatly at different times. Now in verse 5 it says this, "Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is, Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her." In the next portion of our story, we see that Esther has been taken up as one of these ladies. They sent out all this word into all this area, and they're getting all these different women to bring them in and see who kind of makes that cut and who can go back home or who needs to stay. Well, Esther's taken in, and she's to remain there. In that day and time, for most, if not all, I don't know, it would be considered a great honor to be chosen to be in the citadel, in the palace, to to be under the watch care and in a relationship with the king. I really don't know exactly what Esther's feelings about it were. I'm not so sure that she had much of a choice, but being that she was without a father and mother, she was under the watch care of Mordecai, this is what happened. This is where they lived. Now, maybe they should have moved. Maybe they shouldn't have lived there. We don't know. There's so much to the story that we don't know. But what we do know is that up until this point, a lot of things have happened in her life. A lot of things have happened in the lives of her people. They're being taken into captivity. They're being released. Some of them choosing not to leave. Some of them being comfortable in Persia and staying. Well, here she is. She's under the watch care of Mordecai. He has this job at the citadel. He's there. Right, wrong, I'm not sure what the case is exactly. I don't feel like that's a choice that I would have made, but I know the whole story and everything that's going to happen. And so I don't want to be too judgy on Mordecai or on Esther or what they're doing or why they haven't moved or whatever the case may be. But at this point in the story, she's taken in. This is where she's supposed to be. She's moved up a little bit. Whether she wants to be there or not, I'm not really sure. But here she is. She's moved to the next level. And all the while, because I know what's going to happen in the rest of the book of Esther, I know that God is doing something in her life. Maybe despite her circumstances, maybe even despite her disobedience or Mordecai's disobedience or the disobedience of past generations, God is already working out protection and already working out provision for a problem that really hasn't come to the surface just yet. And so she hasn't revealed that she's a Jew. Why would she not do that? There's a lot of disdain and there's a lot of, anger and hatred towards people who are Jewish in that area, in that culture, in that day, in that time, not because of anything they were doing at that time, but just some anti-Semitism that had carried over from one generation to the next. And so they're not really just broadcasting to everyone that they're Jewish because they kind of get lumped in with other people and unfounded hate and things like that. So in verse 12, it says this, "And when the turn came for each young woman to go in to King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women, when the young woman went in to the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity." So now we see how the story has moved along, and Esther is now crowned queen. She could have been just, a concubine, just another person in the harem there, but instead she is elevated to this position. Now, she was a beautiful, and you see that there's a lot of emphasis in the story placed on her outward beauty. She didn't actually have to take a lot with her. She just took what was recommended. And so why is it that there's such a fixation on outward beauty? Now, remember, this story is taking place in Persia, and the Persians are fixated on things like that, and the king's selecting a queen based on that criteria. Now, guys, I'm not telling you that, your wife shouldn't be beautiful, but don't be in a relationship with someone you're not attracted to. Don't be dating that person looking to marry them if you're not happy with them and you're not attracted to them. But we also know, biblically speaking, that there's so much more to a person, man, woman, either way, than just how they look on the outside. And so what the king should have been doing was looking for a queen based on it. But remember, the criteria he's using and the way that he's selecting his queen is based on what his advisors had said. Now, as we know from the story, God is moving Esther into a position that she needs to be in, so that her people will be delivered, so that the lineage will go on, and so that great things will happen later in history. But at that time, the king is so easily influenced and so easily fixated on things that are temporary. And this king, I'm just going to go ahead and say it, he's not the wisest king that ever lived. But we see that he ends up with a good queen, by God's own divine providence. No matter what, God is going to have His way. His will is going to be accomplished no matter how that needs to take place. And so that happens, and they have this great feast, and it's in honor of Esther, and everybody knows that, and surely everybody's happy, especially with the remission of taxes to the provinces, and that gifts have been given with royal generosity. So the king seems to be very happy. Esther has been, put in this new position as the queen, and in doing that, in verse 19, this is what happens. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Any time that anyone did something that was loyal to the king, he would always make special note of it and write it down. He wanted to know who they were, where they're from, their name, all that, maybe who their father was, things like that. And he would keep a good detailed record, and he would swiftly and generously reward that person. And so here's Mordecai. He used to have a job at the citadel. Now he's going to be promoted and have an actual position. His name is recognized, and people know who he is, so he has more respect and things like that. Why? Because he's been faithful to the king and reporting that to the queen. The queen said, hey, Mordecai passed along this information. There was an investigation. And you see all these different things in the story are happening. Now, days are passing and things are happening that aren't recorded here, but these special details are recounted for us so that we can see how in Esther's life, in her story, how God has worked, oftentimes in the background, unbeknownst to them at that time, before they ever knew there was a problem, God was already providing the solution. That is so encouraging to us to know that God cares for His people, that He's going to accomplish His good and perfect will, and that He's going to do things in our life and through our life and around our lives that oftentimes we're not aware of. One thing it reminds me of is this, that if I were to try to count all the blessings that God has given to me, I couldn't number them. And one of the reasons I couldn't number them is because I don't even recognize all of the things that God has done for me. And so today I want you to be encouraged that God is doing great things for His people, that sometimes we endure trials and difficulty, and sometimes we have to really, really get down on our knees and pray and seek the Lord's face and ask for His help. But God is ultimately in control. No one takes control away from Him. Even if there's a ruler or if someone's in charge or an authority, if it's a king and he takes bad advice, or it doesn't matter. Ultimately, God's in control, and Christians, we can rest in that fact and be encouraged that God is going to have His perfect way, that He's going to fulfill everything that He's ever promised to us. I just love this story and can't wait to get into episode 3. God bless you, and I'll see you later this week.